Welcome to the March edition of Parenting Hacks, where we try to make things virtually easier for families. And tonight we are going to be discussing a topic near and dear to my heart, which is how to have a portable IEP document. And this goes with managing changes when your child is going to be moving to a new educational home. My name is Maura Albritton, and tonight I am happily assisted by Joe Goyos, my colleague, as well as Mario Garcia, who is going to be providing Spanish interpretation. So we have put a slideshow together that basically takes the idea of moving to a new classroom, to a new school, to a new school district, to a new state, and tries to kind of follow the same sort of process that we're all familiar with. Unless we have lived in the exact same house, in the exact same room our entire lives, we have had to relocate. Some of us have done it a lot. Some of us may have not done it as often, but the process is pretty much similar as we talk about finding a place for your child to live during school hours. So all of the same things that you look for in a home are the same things you kind of look for in a school, right? Location, transportation options, the neighborhood. Is this a place that my child will have friends and activities that keep them busy and interested? And often, I'm going to ask Joe to slide to the next slide. Often we are looking first at our neighborhood schools. However, I wanted to provide, this is a fairly recent update to the Parents Guide to San Diego Schools. It's put out by the Voice of San Diego, and it allows you to really get a really nice overview of all the different kinds of schools. It has charters, it has public schools, it has information links to the schools, and I wanted folks to have that just as a reference. Let's go ahead and switch to the next slide. So having a clear picture of what a school is known to offer is one part of getting ready to move. But we also want to, also balance that with what might not be a good fit. However, when we look at a student that is receiving special education, we often ask, like, is that automatic option, that neighborhood school, is it going to offer a placement that's consistent with your child's current IEP? So a little overview on this is that most of the time, our secondary schools will have a continuum of general education with accommodations, general education with supports and services, which is usually an IEP, and also a separate setting with, a flexible or fluid separate setting. But not all secondary schools will offer super specific strategies. They may not have super specialized programs or curriculum. However, when we look at elementary schools, they typically have those same basic, like general education with accommodations, which is typically like a 504 plan, general education with supports and related services, like an IEP, and general education with mild, moderate services, whether they're pull out or push in. Most of the districts locally have specific elementary schools in which they bring together or group students with specific kinds of needs together. So this would include students who require separate settings for moderate to severe disability, so the specialized instruction. Other kinds of school classrooms that may not be available in every single elementary school include services for students that have complex medical or nursing supports, sometimes for very specific and specialized behavioral services. And also, there's often efforts to group some of our low incidence disabilities, such as visual impairment. They will have a site that they try to serve students with visual impairments. Sometimes they may have a deaf or hard of hearing placement. So that is, if you have a child that fits into one of those categories, these are questions to ask of your district before you're arriving. So when we look at hiring movers in our moving analogy, the first thing we really look at is, what are we going to move? And so the advice we have is to carefully look at all the aspects of your child's current IEP. And more importantly, think about what are the things that are most important to help him or her access the general education environment and curriculum, and what services and supports are promoting that least restrictive environment. And so sometimes what we find is that our child's IEP has been eroded by some familiarity. So what I recommend is that you call an IEP team meeting at least 2 months before you know you're moving, if you know that far in advance. And this is so that the team can come together and make sure that everything that's essential about your child's IEP and services are adequately described in writing in the document. Often when we've had a child at one school site for several years in a row, the team starts to kind of make assumptions like, well, we know which classroom they're going to, or we know, this speech therapist is going to have the child year after year. And so sometimes we stop putting in quite so much detail because we know we're all in the room, we know what we're doing, and we're passing a student along. And so the important thing as a parent is to read it as if you didn't know what your child was getting from the school district right now. So everybody knowing your child, we know that sometimes accommodations, behavior plans get just maybe the reality and practice don't quite match what's in that document anymore, and we need to bring those into alignment. You do not, as a parent, want to be the person telling the new school what your child needs. You'll be doing that enough, I promise. You would really like the sending school or the old school to be telling the receiving school or the new school what your child needs in the form of an IEP that's adequate, correct, detailed. And the other little tip on the screen is to don't forget to let the new school know your child is coming with an IEP. Even beforehand, it's nice to just send a note like incoming. We have an incoming IEP. I'll be sending it. Please know we're coming. And sometimes they'll want to have a conversation. Sometimes they'll be interested in attending a meeting. Sometimes they'll say, let us know when you actually have an address. That happens too. But it's still a courtesy, and one that I think helps to start folks off on the right foot with a new school. Joe, go ahead and give me the next slide, please. So when we're getting ready to pack out, and that means to really think about what we're going to actually take with us, a couple of things. Typically, the school that is receiving the student is going to request records. That is part of the process. It's their obligation to do so. However, when you are moving, especially to a different district, especially out of state, it is a good time. It is really best practice to make sure that you have physical possession of sort of that minimum necessary records. And so that would be a full and complete copy of the signed IEP, the most recent signed IEP. It would be a full copy of the latest assessment reports, a full copy of report cards and progress reports for the last year, and then also a printout of any state-related or state testing results as applicable, if that applies to your child. So typically in California, that won't start happening until 3rd grade. And then in case we have anyone who has what we call a twice exceptional student, so a student that has an IEP but is also identified as gifted and talented, a copy of that identification letter from the other program would be helpful. One other thing is that we are thinking about an opportunity to make sure that IEP and the things coming with it, and I'm not talking about your child, I'm talking about the other things like behavior plans, and I'm going to go into more detail about the other things, but just we're going to start to think about making sure that everything we're sending is grade level and age appropriate. So I think back to my son when we were transitioning. I have 5 children. They have attended over 30 schools now because they're older. And one of the transitions I remember fondly was one where we realized that his Thomas the Tank Engine was probably not appropriate for middle school because he loved Thomas the Tank Engine. And so we were like, oh, time to bring in something that's more like heavy equipment, like more, like a little bit more age appropriate, a little bit more mature. We're going to leave the cartoons behind. We're gonna make sure that when we come to that new school, we are, coming in with something that's appropriate to the age and to meeting our new friends. Okay, next slide, please, Joe. So when we make that household inventory, and I'm a military spouse, so I've moved a few times. This is, when you move in real life, what happens? You try to get rid of stuff. You do a big purge. And so you whittle down to like, what is the minimum I want to have to move? More, what's the minimum I'm going to unpack? And so you will want to make an inventory of what you have. Moving companies do this. They stick those little stickers on the item in the boxes. And so on the next slide, we're going to go through a sample checklist. Now, my checklist is not going to be the exact same as your checklist, but there'll be some similarities. And just seeing what I've included may start to have you go, oh, I want to think about these other pieces of the IEP. So let's go to that list, Joe. So things that the IEP, when, again, think back, we want to have a portable IEP. If my son were swept up in a tornado and deposited in the middle of Nebraska, how is that school going to know what he needs? It's going to be the IEP, and it's going to be an IEP written in language that isn't overly California and is clear, concise, and very descriptive. So the first thing here is a clear description of the placement my child is in right now. And so that may be described as a separate setting or a general education setting. That's just one part, though. We're going to be talking about what kind of credential does his case manager have? What kind of credential does his other teachers have? What subjects is my child in general education for? And actually, sometimes we go even deeper. Sometimes a child is in, let's say, English language arts for parts of that period and then pulled out for other parts. So what parts of general ed is my child in? What parts are they providing services in a pullout? Those are very important, and it's very detailed. Sometimes we need to know how many students are in the class. Like, what is the ratio, especially for a separate setting, knowing that the classroom may have 10 students and 3 adults, then that kind of description, or a description of up to 12 students with 3 adults. Those kinds of descriptions are helpful. Again, what is that staff to student ratio, and so on. Like if there are special services that are built into that placement and not recorded somewhere else on your child's IEP, then they need to be in that description of the placement. Okay, the next one is assistive technology. And so that is any equipment that your child has. It can be hardware or software when we think about computers. They may not say what specific program they're using, but they may say that they have access to a word processing device. They have access to an augmentative communication device that uses the Unity system or that uses Meyer-Johnson picture exchange communication system. Like they need to describe what your child is using, what your child needs. If your child has a wireless mouse, if your child has headphones, if your child has fidget toys provided by the district, if they have special positioning equipment, bolsters, specific kind of like a specific chair for feeding, access to a changing table, all of those kinds of things go into that list of assistive technology, adaptive equipment that your child will need to be able to access their curriculum and make progress on their goals. Next, number 4, we are at specialized instruction. And when I say including curriculum, I am not saying that the districts necessarily need to say what curriculum they're using, although it would certainly help if a child is receiving a very specialized kind of program to say, hey, they're at, they're using this program, Touch Math. They've gotten to book, let's say lesson 42. I'm just making that up. What I find even more important is if a student has been exposed to or tried to use a curriculum and we have, as a team, determined that it was not effective, it is really helpful to have that listed. We have do not recommend, or this curriculum was not effective, did not work well. Those are really helpful things to record, so that the receiving team doesn't start with something that we've already experienced a lack of success trying. Number 5, when we talk about individualized supports, what I mean is priority accommodations. So we can all list accommodations in an IEP document, but the reality is that the teacher has to deliver them, and has to deliver them consistently with fidelity over time. So really honing in on what are those individualized supports that most impact your child's learning, and making sure we describe them with enough specificity that the receiving team can implement them. So it'll be almost seamless is the goal. One of the examples I give is it's not enough to put preferential seating. We have to talk about what does the preferential seating look like for my child. For my child who has autism and needs to be able to take sensory breaks very regularly, priority seating is actually in the back. For another child who might have, might be easily distracted, might have wear glasses, we might want to have that student in the front row so that they can really pay attention to the teacher, see the board, all of those kinds of things. So really thinking through, if we're going to write an accommodation, what is it doing? When are we delivering it? And being really specific. Number 6 is the behavior intervention plan. And if you remember a couple slides ago, I said we have to be able to make sure that what we're doing in practice matches what we have on that binder on the shelf. And so this is an opportunity to really read through, is the behavior plan still appropriate? Do we still need it? And is there anything else we want to add to it? Number 7, related services. So these are things like speech and OT, occupational therapy, physical therapy, music therapy, whatever kind of related service is provided. We want to make sure that it says frequency. And so that might be minutes a year, but it's helpful to put minutes per week. Intensity, which would mean in what size group are we providing that service, as well as location. And I don't mean room 49 or bungalow 26. What I mean is it in a separate setting, or is it push in to the general education classroom? One note I'd like to make is as your child ages, typically, not always, we see that shift where we do a little less pull out and a little more push in as appropriate, but that's a general trend that you will see. And then number 8 is looking at change management. And this really is, how are we going to make sure that the team here that's sending this student, how are we going to help them to transfer their knowledge to the next team? And we have some ideas for that coming up. Joe, can you go to the next slide? So high value crating. In a military move, if you have something that's somewhat expensive, I've never personally had something expensive enough to be crated, but they can hire someone to do a specific box they build the box around the item in order to protect it. And so this is an opportunity for us to think about some health considerations, especially if you're physically relocating out of one area into another. Getting your forms from the new school that will need to be filled out in order for medication to be given. It's helpful to think through that and get the current physician to write that order. It's helpful because number 1, sometimes it takes a while to establish care with a new doctor. The other thing is to make sure that if your child has any sort of individualized health service plan, if they have a seizure action plan, an asthma action plan, any of the other kinds of plans that are out there, make sure that those plans are updated. Make sure that any health needs that are being provided or addressed during the school day are recorded, and like the medicine is correct, the dosage is correct, all of those kinds of details. If your child has nursing services, making sure that they've specified an LVN or an RN or a health tech, who is doing, who's providing those services, and what are those services like spelled out in excruciating detail. Any training that might be needed to perform those services should also be included. Next slide, please. So for a door-to-door move, if you think about it, we talk about we don't, when we're moving cross country, when we move cross country, we want our goods to be packed on the truck, and then it's a race to get across country so that we can get them right off the truck. You really try not to have your goods go into storage unless you have to. It costs more, and there's just the likelihood of something unpleasant happening to your possessions increases with each time that somebody's touching your stuff. So I tried to kind of think through what would a door-to-door move look like for a youngster with an IEP. The easiest way to achieve that like really seamless move is to try to find a time that the receiving team can participate in some way in some sort of meeting, IEP meeting, with the sending team. Now, when you're moving from school to school within a district, this is much easier to accomplish than if you're moving cross country. We're in different time zones. Often the receiving school is a little uneasy about participating because they're not sure you're going to actually ever be their student, unless you already own a house or something there. And so really trying to be inclusive of the receiving team members. And now we have Zoom, and that really has helped to lower the barrier to having those kinds of meetings. When, I'm trying to think what else I want to say about this slide. I think this is good. Mostly that you have to ask. If you don't ask, is it less likely to happen? If you ask and you're working with these teams, it is more likely to happen. Okay, next slide, Joe. So things that might help your child before the move is to see the school, ideally in person, but again, with Zoom, with video, with technology, we have a real opportunity to be able to view places that we aren't a lot easier. Meeting staff or possibly some students, that's another way, whether it's in pictures, whether it's Zooming with them, whether it is whether you are able to have a phone call. Those are all ways to try to connect and to preview what's coming soon. Before the move, I think it's really important to try to model model a positive attitude toward moving. If you are saying things like, oh, I wish we weren't doing this and it's going to be so hard. I mean, kids really do pick up on that, and modeling like the opportunity. And when we get here, these are the things that are going to be new and exciting, does really help to set the temperature of that move. And then before the move, if your child already has a mental health professional in their life, this is an opportunity to get some extra help in supporting your child ahead of that move. After the move, when I talk about parental A game, it's so important for us to not get so paying attention to the school and the change and the unpacking and all of that we lose sight of those real basics of nutrition and sleep and exercise and, medication compliance and all the things that we do on a daily basis for our kids. Those are all things that help them to be able to have good days at school. And so we have to keep doing those, obviously, reinforcing new routines, and then also just being available without expecting perfection. So when we look at, I think that's good. Let's keep going, Joe. So when we talk about a Diddy move or a do-it-yourself move, the more you take on, the more likely it will be done to your satisfaction. I think that we all kind of recognize that. However, the more you take on, the more you are taking on. And so I do encourage you to be realistic. If you're already moving and managing kids and lots of moving parts, it's, be realistic on what you can be responsible for, and don't be afraid to, ask the team to write in what they can do. Um, Having some sort of summary or introduction sheet sometimes helps. Having a copy of the records, having at least photos of whatever sort of behavior system, visual schedule, those kinds of things. Having, if you can bring the hard copies already made and ready to go, that's one less thing that your child is going to have to adapt to and get used to. You can help and be involved in drafting a social story, or you can collaborate with a team member. And then when we talk about making introductions, I like to connect the sending, let's say the sending physical therapist. I like to have an email, connect them to the receiving physical therapist. Sometimes that has to wait until you're physically know who that person is going to be, but you can always reach backward. But having that conversation and making the request while you're still on their caseload seems to make a big difference. And it's more likely that people are going to follow through when you start the communication and make it easy for them. Next slide. Meeting the new neighbors. This is, both exciting and stressful. And so this is your child's fresh start, and it's also, for some of us, a chance to have a fresh start ourselves. If you had, times that were a little more difficult with an IEP team, that is kind of a nice feature of, a change in team. Yes, you leave behind people that you have, developed a relationship with, or are familiar with working with together. However, it's an opportunity for your child to have, a new approach. Sometimes, kind of shaking things up and having a new set of eyes on your child. Sometimes we see growth from that. So I try not to, overly predict that it's going to be, oh, we're going to lose progress. Sometimes we gain great things from having a change in placement. And so the other thing is, just remember, meeting the new neighbors. Your child is a general education child first. So the principal, like everything from the principal and the custodian and the nurse and the librarian, like all of those people, they are meeting too. So don't be afraid to ask for those names. We don't just have to live in our little special education lane. It's the whole school. They need to be meeting and welcoming your child. Next, Joe. So when we're meeting the new neighbors, do what works for you and your family. There's opportunities to volunteer. There's always, of course, a list of things people would like to have donated. And there's always meetings to attend. So especially if you're going to a new state, I'm very able to talk to you pretty specifically about ways to get involved in California schools. But don't be afraid to reach out and to get involved, and to sometimes we may pause and say, oh, we're going to wait until our child settles in. Sometimes it helps them settle in to see us getting involved. And let's see the next slide, please. So signing the lease, this is kind of my slide about the 30-day review. So when you move, the receiving school does not have the luxury of a timeline to wait to provide services. They need to look at the IEP. They need to make a pretty rapid determination of where your child is going to go, and they need to start serving your child. Charlie, please close the door. Okay. Sorry. It is also, again, the receiving school's responsibility to obtain records from that sending school. No move is going to be exactly the same, even if you're within the same school, the same cluster, the same district, same state. The move will always feel different. But when we are meeting after your child is there, there's going to be a interim review, because this is a new placement, and they're going to want to put that IEP you came with on their form. And they're going to want it to be put in language that makes sense to them. So yes, you will have just made the IEP beautiful to take it to them, and then they're going to say, we need to have another IEP. One tip that I have is to, when you arrive at a new school, is to ask them for a copy of a blank IEP so that you can sit with it and your child's current IEP and get a feeling for where things are going to go on their form. Especially if if you're staying in the same district, it's going to be the same form. But if you're moving somewhere else, it often is a different kind of form. And sometimes there's different language. The law is the same. Federal law is the same, I should say, but how they choose to record it, the order that the pages are, those are things that if you look ahead of time can kind of take away some of that anxiety or uncertainty going into your first IEP at the new school. And the other tip when you're signing the lease is to read the procedural safeguards that they give you, particularly if you've moved to a new state. But heck, I say reread them even if you're still in California, just to kind of refresh your memory and be ready to, have these kinds of conversations. Next slide, please. Yay, unpacking, all the stickers. Unpacking takes time. I don't care where you're moving from and to. The new placement will not feel like home initially. It doesn't. It's not going to be like we flip a switch and this is all perfect and glorious. And you think about when you move a house. I know, like I stub my toe because the chair isn't in the right spot, or I misplaced my keys because I was used to putting them here and that place doesn't exist in the new house, or I get lost trying to find Target, or whatever it is. Your child is going to have some of these same experiences being in a new school, and this is normal. And this is a chance for us to just think, it doesn't mean that the school isn't trying. It doesn't mean that it's not a good placement, but these are normal experiences, and our kids are going to experience the full gamut. Next slide. So the next several slides are an opportunity to go through what things you might want to be considering as you make some grade level kinds of moves. So the first one is looking at a preschooler moving into an elementary school. So I know California is going to a universal TK, universal transition kindergarten, but right now I'm just thinking like preschool to kindergarten. Some things that you might want to be thinking and discussing with your team are, how is your child going to react to a change in the length of instructional day? These could include things, I go really practical. Things like, has my child been napping? And do we need any supports as we move to being, awake and alert and participative for a longer day? If my child takes medications and I had been giving them at home, what does this mean? What needs to go in the IEP? What forms do I need to fill out in order to make sure that medication can be given at school? Before and after school care often becomes something to consider for our students when they move into that full day elementary school. And things like cafeteria and food service. When your child's a preschooler only attending for a short period of time, these things aren't really things we have to worry about. Now we might have to worry about them. Not worry, but at least plan for them. When your child is moving, even within the same school, preschool to kindergarten, often that means because of licensing rules, the playground's going to change. That means there's going to be bigger kids using the playground. It's going to be a different playground, different equipment. So being able to have those kinds of conversations and planning around that is sometimes appropriate. Leaving preschool, going into elementary school, it's an opportunity to talk about safety. Your child's going to be there for a longer day. Anything safety related is always appropriate. So all the things on the preschool slide can continue to be appropriate for all the other ones that I'm about to talk about. But safety issues that you might want to consider could be eloping, could be things like allergies, could be how is your child going to participate in field trips, assuming we get to start those again. And then I have parent-teacher communications, and you're going to see on the next few slides, parent-teacher communications is on every slide, because as my child moves from a very small preschool environment to larger classroom sizes, to older grades, the nature and frequency and the characteristics of the parent-teacher communications will kind of evolve. And so it's good to have a conversation and set some reasonable expectations. Certainly when my children were in preschool, you'd go to pick them up and there'd be little ouch slips, or there would be a quick conversation with the teacher. And those things are not always feasible when we're talking bigger and bigger classrooms. Let's go to the next slide, please. So if we're talking about other kinds of elementary transitions, things like recess. If your child's going to a new school, it's nice to sometimes be able to ask the receiving school, what are the games that are popular? I know one of my kids moved and it was like Foursquare was really big at one school. Wall ball was the name of the game at another school. So just having some of those kinds of kind of informational points, it helps you write social stories, but it also helps to kind of get a sense of what preparing your child for the next school placement. Food service, again, codes that they might have to be aware of, the decision on hot lunch, cold lunch, all of those kinds of things. Technology expectations, knowing what the child is going to have to use. I know like Seesaw is one that we use locally, having login information available for any of the enrichment programs that might be appropriate. Again, extra care options are something to consider. The site safety plan might be something that you want to talk about. And that, locally we have like wildfires and earthquake drills, but especially when we're thinking about students who might use mobility aids or who wouldn't follow instructions, it's helpful to have a conversation about like, who's going to be with my child for a fire drill? How is my child going to be able to safely exit? Those kinds of questions are appropriate, and particularly when you're changing schools. Again, parent-teacher communications, and again, the before school and after school opportunities are things you might want to consider talking about. Just because I put them on other considerations, some of these might be IEP conversations, and some of them might just be things that you as the parent are researching and thinking about and working to support. I'm thinking like before school, like some schools have a running club, some compete about collecting recycling, some of them have morning flags and assemblies. The more you learn about that school and its climate before your child attends is more that you can put into the into a social story, more ways that you can prompt your child or prepare your child or preview for your child what the experience will be like. And the other thing is what kinds of after school programs are available. Those are all considerations that you might that might be appropriate. Next slide for middle school or junior high. When I think about PE, I think about, does the school change out? Is my child going to need help navigating the locker room? Is my child going to need assistance with dressing? We think about lockers. Can my child operate a combination lock? Do I need to, do we need to practice that ahead of time? If they don't have a locker, are we going to need a rolling backpack? Are we going to need a set of books for at home and at school so my child isn't lugging something super heavy? And so that's another conversation to be. This might be an IEP conversation. It might be something that you're working with the school on, as a general education student would. So that kind of handles textbooks. We talk about the loss of recess. This is really kind of a big deal for a lot of our students because it really does put that increased conversational load. There's a lack of structure and also a loss of physical movement opportunities. So really looking at how are we going to fill that time? How is my child going to get the break and that pause that they need in the middle of their day without that recess or without, and what kinds of supports might they need? When we look at passing periods, we're not just looking at how are they gonna, like for stairs or for elevators, things like time anxiety I had a middle schooler that had a really tough time getting from one end of the campus to the other end of the campus in the given time, and it was really a big deal for him that he wasn't on time or that he was going to be tardy. Those are things that might need to have accommodations built in. This is an opportunity to get a campus map and help to kind of get used to, like, okay, there are water fountains here, there are bathrooms here. All of those things for different students can be helpful ways of preparing for a change. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about connections with peers. So that there's a few things I think of. One is starting in middle school, we sometimes hear about, they call them circle of friends, or they can have other sorts of clubs. We want to be sure and know what's available and make sure that if it's something that you think would be appropriate for your child, that the forms or the request is made to participate. I also start to think about, certainly in middle school, the potential for bullying. It's a real thing, and really being aware and having those conversations, the frank conversation with school personnel, and that it is a continuous process improvement, that as things come up, you may very well have to engage around that issue. When we talk about moving with a child with a disability into junior high, the other thing that is sometimes cause for concern is just how do we create a supportive environment? How do we make friends when we don't have kids together all day? And so really finding out if a school has any sort of welcome program, any sort of group of students that are there to help welcome new students, that's something to be asked for. When we look at reading and math, if your child still has goals that are for if your child's still learning to read, if your child does not have really such strong English language arts skills, it is imperative because reading is not typically a general ed function in middle school. It is so important that if your child is still a struggling reader, that there is clear that you're having a discussion with the IEP team about getting a specific multisensory, explicit sequential literacy instruction program discussed and agreed upon, because we can no longer count on that happening within the school day as a rule. So that's one piece of advice. And again, with math, really having those conversations. What are we going to do to help accelerate growth in those two subjects? Let's see. And then again, parent-teacher communications. As a student moves to middle school, they typically will have more teachers involved, and they will be one of a larger group, particularly if they are mostly in a general education setting. So just starting to kind of have reasonable expectations for the amount of communication and being really clear about what your expectations are. I often recommend that as part of an IEP that parents ask for a communication plan where we explicitly define under what conditions you expect a phone call the same day, under what conditions you expect a check-in, and just having that open, clear communication and in an agreed upon modality. And I think we are ready for the high school slide. Thank you, Joe. So special considerations for high school. First and foremost, a lot of our high schools, especially in San Diego, have career or technical education pathways. And so knowing what those pathways are, knowing what the choices are, and making sure that you are able to advocate for your child to participate if you think that that would be appropriate, that we really need to make sure that all students have an opportunity to have a meaningful course of study through their high school years. Another thing is course planning. Typically, there will be discussions about, is your child acquiring enough credits to earn a diploma? Those are very specific conversations, and a recommendation there is that that your child's counselor, high school counselor responsible for counting those credits, be a participant at your child's IEP meetings, so that their information and the IEP team's information are getting shared. When we think about going to a new high school, another thing that families don't all, at least here, it seems like we mostly have closed campuses for lunch, but certainly if you move to a different area, that might not be the case. So something to ask about and to be aware of, and to be able to have the IEP team and your child prepared for that. Another thing that I think families don't always think about, but I've certainly had some personal experience for, is the issue of restrooms. These are sometimes hard to solve until you're actually in the situation. But if you have a rule follower, vaping, inappropriate language, and some other things may be issues for the restroom and may take some creative problem solving. We look at clubs and teams, and just as a reminder, we do not have priorities, priority club membership or priority. You still have to try out, you still have to audition, even if you are a student with a disability. But knowing what's available and knowing what supports might be available are still appropriate conversations. Again, with the technology learning curve, lots of Google Classroom, lots of Canvas use, lots of being able to manipulate data, whether that means being able to take a picture and upload it, being able to participate in Jamboards or message boards. And if your child is going to need specific instruction in order to do those things, then those might need to go in the IEP. Another conversation might be if your child needs to be able to do paper and pencil tasks, that there might need to be accommodation so that your child doesn't have to do all the technology pieces, that they have an alternative way of submitting information or submitting assignments. And then as a special note, math is really painful to watch your child type. So take it from me. Good to have those conversations. And then again, parent-teacher communications. And I think we are on to the next slide. I wanted to let you know that we will be having a more specific hour-and-a-half training on individualized transition plans next month. So there is a link if you have a student who is 15 years or older. Next slide. That's the thank you, but we have a couple more announcements before we go to questions and answers. We do have an upcoming office hour, so if you have really specific questions, we try to allow for like privacy issues by not taking super specific questions in our Zoom webinars, but you are certainly welcome to sign up for Wednesday night from 8 to 9. Joe and I are available to help brainstorm. Next slide. And we have a couple of upcoming conferences. So if you happen to be in Imperial Valley, there is an Imperial Valley Parent Conference coming up on March 26th. And this is the fresh off the press, save the date. And then we also have IEP Day coming on Saturday, April 30th. The cost is $70, and it is vendored for regional center consumers to be able to apply their funds to that program. And also, go back one, Joe. If you're not if your child is not a regional center client, please don't let money be the reason you don't participate. So please don't hesitate to contact either IEP Day, or next slide is how to reach Joe or myself. And you can certainly, if you want to participate in one of these programs, and please feel free. And let's go back to the questions. Actually, let's go to being able to see people. I know I kind of went a little fast through the information, but I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions and answers